He had been joking with me about caffeine intake when he flipped to the final page of the report. His pen had been tapping a slow rhythm against the folder, the way physicians often do when they've already formed a lighthearted prescription. Less coffee, more water, maybe a jog in the mornings. But the pen stopped. His eyes moved once, twice, over the lines of numbers and codes. He adjusted his glasses, then angled the page as though a different tilt might alter the ink. My daughter was seated in the corner, cross-legged on the carpet tiles, filling in the wings of a cartoon bird with a blunt crayon. She hummed, off-key but steady, the way she did when she wanted me to know she was comfortable. I had nearly relaxed into the moment, ready to promise to reduce my espresso habit, when the doctor's face drained of color. He didn't look at me immediately. His gaze caught my daughter's small frame, the yellow crown of her hair bent over the coloring book. Then, slowly, he returned his eyes to mine. He closed the folder with more care than necessary, as if the papers inside might scatter or be misread by anyone else in the room. "Sir," he said, voice measured, professional, "this result is incompatible." I asked him to explain, though I knew from his pause that he wasn't referring to cholesterol or blood pressure. The word hung between us, technical but final. He reopened the folder, showing me a section highlighted in gray. "Paternity markers," he said quietly, tapping the block of data. "The allelic profiles don't correspond. Statistically, it excludes you as the biological father." I felt the chair under me stiffen, as if the cushion had been replaced by metal. I read the line he indicated. Alleles at multiple loci, compared against the child's reference sample taken during her pediatric visit. Numbers, codes, ratios, all lined in a neat column under the heading Probability of Paternity, 0.00%. He slid a separate sheet across the desk, an automated printout from the lab. I noticed the timestamp, 6:43 that morning, along with the accession number and technician's initials. It was not a draft. Not a clerical guess. "I don't understand," I managed, though the evidence was plain. The doctor, careful with his words, noted that such tests are usually run under controlled circumstances, but since my blood had been drawn alongside my daughter's as part of a genetic screening panel for hereditary conditions, the analysis had been conducted as a matter of protocol. "It's routine quality assurance in some clinics," he said, cross-checking family samples for accurate baselines. My daughter looked up then, oblivious to the language, holding up her page for me to see. A lopsided bird, one wing filled with thick blue. "Daddy, is it good?" she asked. I nodded automatically, the word sticking in my throat before it emerged. The doctor offered to rerun the test, to confirm the exclusion wasn't an error in labeling or chain of custody. He explained that in rare cases, samples can be misfiled, but the way his hand rested on the report told me he trusted the integrity of what he was showing me. I folded the page back into the folder, trying not to crumple the edges. Outside the office window, traffic moved in its regular pattern, unbroken, ordinary. Inside, the air was dense, thick with something I hadn't prepared to face. I knew I had to follow precisely. I asked for the requisition forms, the accession numbers, anything that established how the samples had moved from collection to report. He printed out the laboratory's chain of custody log, bar-coded entries with timestamps, technician initials, and electronic signatures. My daughter's sample had been drawn at 9:12, 2 weeks prior, mine at 9:34 the same morning. Both were logged under consecutive accession numbers, 45732A and 45732B, transported together to the central lab and signed in by a technician whose initials matched the report I now held. I noted each item: the accession sheet, the courier log, the electronic confirmation of receipt. Nothing suggested a misfile. Still, I told the doctor I wanted a second analysis done by an independent lab. He agreed, writing me a referral, careful to phrase it as a confirmatory genetic panel, rather than naming the conflict aloud in front of my daughter. His discretion struck me. He spoke as though we were handling a sensitive audit rather than a personal fracture. That evening, after she was asleep, I placed the folder on the kitchen table. My wife wasn't home yet. The clock showed 22:17. Her late nights had once been explained by project deadlines, client dinners, traffic. I stared at the timestamps on the lab forms instead, measuring how precise and clean they looked against the growing irregularities in my own house. I created a file of my own, spiral notebook, first page dated and timed, 22/19, initiated personal review of genetic report. I listed the documents I had: accession sheet, courier log, lab summary, doctor's referral. Each entry was copied word for word, accession numbers included. I wasn't sure what I would do with it, only that documenting everything gave me a narrow surface to stand on. The next morning, I arranged to have both my daughter and me retested at a separate facility across town. This lab required signed consent forms. I initialed mine in blue ink, hers with my parental authority. I asked for sealed duplicates of the samples to be retained in their archive. The receptionist looked at me curiously but complied. Waiting for those results, I combed through what little I had access to. Insurance statements from my wife's health plan showed repeated visits to her OB/GYN beyond what had seemed normal at the time. Follow-up consults billed months apart, each noted with vague diagnostic codes. At the time, I had skimmed them, assuming they were routine checks. I printed them out now, highlighting dates. At work, I maintained composure, completing reports and attending calls. My profession, procurement within a logistics firm, trained me to cross-verify invoices, match serials, confirm authenticity of signatures. I applied the same discipline to the evidence on my kitchen table each night. 3 days later, the second lab called me in. I sat across from a different geneticist, a younger man with clipped speech. He handed me the sealed envelope without comment. Inside, another paternity analysis, allelic comparison across 15 loci. Again, probability of paternity, 0.00%. Different lab, same conclusion. The geneticist explained the redundancy of markers, the impossibility of exclusion by coincidence. His words were procedural, clinical, 2 independent analyses, both excluding. That establishes certainty beyond a reasonable margin. He slid the report back toward me, as though distancing himself from the personal impact it carried. I asked for certified copies. He initialed the envelope, noted the time, and provided me with 3 duplicates. Each bore the lab's embossed seal, the accession numbers stamped along the footer. That night, I sat in the parked car outside my house for nearly an hour before going inside. My wife's car was already there. The lights in the kitchen were on. Through the window I could see her at the counter, phone pressed between ear and shoulder, hands moving briskly as she spoke. The domestic scene looked ordinary, but in the folder on the seat beside me lay 2 reports stating, without ambiguity, that my daughter was not biologically mine. I carried the folder in with me, though I didn't open it. Instead, I placed it in the locked drawer of my desk in the study. Then I retrieved my notebook, writing Day 4, confirmatory test received. Duplicate exclusion established. I knew what my training told me to do in professional settings when discrepancies appeared. Trace the source, secure evidence, verify against independent records, escalate only when the documentation was beyond contest. At home, the same principle applied. Before speaking a word to her, I needed more. The next step was subtle. I requested from the pediatric clinic copies of every lab requisition and immunization record tied to my daughter since birth. They were released upon my signature the following week. Leafing through them, I saw hospital discharge summaries, vaccination logs, well visit notes. Everything looked routine. Then, at the back, a line I hadn't expected. Neonatal screening. Paternity panel deferred. Sample archived. The note was dated 2 days after her birth. I hadn't known such a panel had even been considered. I filed the copy into my growing dossier. The motif was becoming clearer. From the moment of birth, samples and notes existed that I had not been told about. I stopped there for the night, setting down my pen. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I closed the drawer, locking the folder away once more, and told myself, proceed carefully as if this were any other investigation. Obtaining my daughter's neonatal records had felt like progress, but the note about the deferred paternity panel raised more questions than it answered. When I called the hospital archives to request the original sample or documentation on why it had been deferred, I was told that neonatal specimens were stored off-site, subject to retention policies, and that any retrieval required formal written justification signed by both parents. The clerk's voice on the line was steady, rehearsed. I asked for the form. She emailed a PDF within the hour, but the signature requirement meant I couldn't proceed without my wife's cooperation. That single barrier slowed the momentum I had built. In procurement terms, it was like hitting a supplier who demanded co-signature before releasing shipping documents. A bottleneck. I filed the form into the folder, noted the date, and marked it as pending signature required. At home, my wife noticed the folder once, lying half-hidden on my desk. She asked casually, "Work project?" I told her yes. Her eyes lingered on it for a second too long before she moved on, returning to the stove. I logged that reaction in my notebook, the same way I would note a supplier's hesitation in answering a pricing question. Small, but observable. Meanwhile, the insurance statements I had collected began to show overlap with charges I couldn't reconcile. On 12/03, a charge listed as genetic consult under her name, billed at a clinic downtown I had never known her to visit. I called the clinic, identifying myself as spouse and policyholder. The receptionist, citing privacy regulations, declined to release details without her written consent. Another dead end. The complications were piling into two categories: institutional barriers requiring her cooperation, and her own behavior, which now seemed carefully ordinary. She still arrived late some nights, claiming workload, yet she placed receipts from casual dinners with colleagues on the counter where I could see them, as though preemptively accounting for her time. It was too polished. One Friday evening, while clearing the kitchen table, I found a slip of paper tucked into a grocery bag. A receipt from a pharmacy across town, dated the previous week. The listed items were common: ibuprofen, vitamins, but the method of payment caught my attention: cash. We rarely used cash. I logged the receipt, photographed it, and placed the original into a labeled envelope. I was careful not to let suspicion override procedure. 2 independent labs had excluded me as the father. Yet, the human instinct to seek alternative explanations pressed in. Mosaicism, rare genetic anomalies, even clerical error, possibilities the geneticist had mentioned only to dismiss. I looked up articles, case studies, medical journals. Each one underlined the same conclusion: exclusion across multiple loci was not explained by such anomalies. At work, my performance held steady, but I noticed myself rereading contract lines twice. My attention fractured. Procurement demanded precision, and I delivered it, but the private investigation filled the margins of my day. I took extended lunches to walk to nearby notary offices, inquiring about protocols for certifying private records. I collected brochures, added them to the file. 2 weeks later, I attempted another angle. Through a contact in HR, I requested a complete insurance utilization statement for the household. It arrived in the form of a PDF with line items coded by service. Again, the genetic consult appeared, this time with a billing code cross-referenced to DNA analysis non-standard. My heart quickened, but the details were sparse, truncated by privacy law. Without her consent, the line remained ambiguous. That evening, I decided to address it directly. I asked her, while she sorted laundry, about the billing code. She looked at me calmly, folding a shirt. "Oh, that," she said. "I was part of a wellness program at work. They ran some optional genetic screens. Nothing serious. I didn't think to mention it." Her tone was even, but the answer felt rehearsed. Still, it was plausible. Corporations did contract such wellness services. This was the complication. Every artifact I collected suggested one story, but each time I brought it near the surface, she provided an explanation that was outwardly rational, leaving the evidence suspended between certainty and ambiguity. In professional audits, such counter-explanations often delayed conclusions for weeks, sometimes months. Here, it meant I could not escalate without risking exposure of my investigation before I was ready. The most pressing obstacle remained the neonatal sample, locked behind her required signature. Without it, I couldn't close the loop between birth records and the present exclusions. I tried drafting the form with both our names, leaving her line blank, imagining a scenario in which she might sign casually, but forging her signature would collapse the integrity of the entire file. Chain of custody mattered, whether in corporate procurement or personal truth. I set the form aside, unsigned. Late one night, after she had gone to bed, I opened my notebook and wrote, "Complication established, institutional barriers and plausible counter-narratives delaying resolution. Integrity requires patience." I underlined the word patience twice, though the pen pressed harder than necessary, leaving grooves in the paper. The folder was growing thicker, its contents orderly, but order alone did not yield closure. I knew the next step would have to involve strategy, a way to bypass the barriers without compromising evidence. But for the moment, I remained in stasis. Reports on one side, explanations on the other, the truth suspended between them. The stalled momentum could not last. I had 2 lab reports, insurance anomalies, and receipts filed under numbered tabs, yet the crucial neonatal record remained sealed. The investigation had shifted from evidence collection into a strategy phase, how to access what I needed without alerting her, and without contaminating the record chain. I began with counsel. Not a full retainer, but a discreet consultation with an attorney who specialized in family law and medical records. We met in a small office above a strip of shops away from the corporate district. I presented the 2 sealed reports and my notebook entries. He listened, tapping a yellow pencil against a pad. His advice was direct. To compel release of those neonatal records, you need either her consent or a court order. Without one, you'll remain locked out. A court order meant disclosure, confrontation, escalation. Too early. But the attorney suggested a preparatory step. File a notarized statement of intent to request such records, attaching the existing lab exclusions. This way, if I needed to proceed formally later, the groundwork would already be time-stamped and recorded. I agreed. He drafted the statement, affixed his seal, and handed me 2 certified copies. Back home, I logged the action in my notebook. Statement of intent filed. 1432, certified copies in folder. That night, I created a sub-index within the file. A for lab reports, B for insurance anomalies, C for receipts, D for legal filings. Each envelope labeled, each cross-referenced. The file was beginning to resemble the audit binders I assembled for external regulators. Neat, complete, defensible. Still, the core obstacle remained. Strategy required more than paper. It required timing. I decided to monitor patterns in her movements more closely. Without overt suspicion, I noted her departures and arrivals. Timestamps when her car left, when headlights swept back across the driveway. Over 2 weeks, a rhythm emerged. Twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, her return extended past 2200. Receipts on the counter always corresponded, restaurant stubs, parking tickets. I photographed them, logged them. Yet the locations varied enough that they explained little. Parallel to this, I pursued a second track, building a credible pretext for requesting archived medical files without her direct involvement. Through an acquaintance in hospital administration, I learned that research audits sometimes triggered sample retrievals from neonatal archives. If flagged as part of a quality review, the process could unfold without parental co-signatures. It was a slim avenue, but possible. I drafted a formal inquiry on hospital letterhead, routed through my attorney contact. Not a demand, but a question. Whether archived samples tied to my daughter's record had been included in any recent quality assurance audits. The reply came a week later. No retrievals noted for accession, #N-198XX. Sample remained sealed in off-site storage. The confirmation was thin, but useful. It established that the sample still existed, intact, not destroyed under retention limits. That fact became another tab in Section D. Meanwhile, the weight of secrecy pressed heavier at home. My daughter continued her coloring rituals in the evenings, presenting birds, houses, uneven suns. Each time she asked, "Is it good, Daddy?" I answered yes, my voice steady. The word had begun to feel less like affirmation and more like a promise I was working to preserve. I refined my approach. If I couldn't obtain the neonatal sample through her, I could prepare for confrontation in such a way that, when disclosure became unavoidable, the evidence package would be unimpeachable. I photocopied every receipt, every report, placing originals in fireproof storage at the bank. I scanned documents, encrypted them on a flash drive, stored duplicates in separate envelopes marked with dates. In procurement audits, redundancy was protection. Here, it was necessity. The attorney suggested one more strategic measure, quietly ordering a background check on my wife's recent medical service providers, especially the clinic that billed for DNA analysis, non-standard. He explained that, as a spouse on the same insurance, I could request provider verification to confirm that charges were legitimate. It would not yield genetic results, but it would verify whether she had engaged such services. The verification arrived 10 days later. The clinic had indeed billed under her name for a genetic analysis panel. The code corresponded not to wellness programs but to comparative DNA testing. The statement included no details on purpose or outcome, but the classification was unambiguous. I logged it under tab B, Insurance Anomalies, and underlined the words comparative DNA. In professional terms, the gap between her explanation and the billing category constituted a variance. In personal terms, it was a fracture line. Strategy now meant readiness. I had built the file, confirmed the neonatal sample's existence, documented her unexplained medical charges, and secured independent paternity exclusions. The path forward was narrowing to a point. Sooner or later, confrontation would be necessary. The timing would determine whether the evidence held or shattered. I closed my notebook that night, noting, "Strategy complete, awaiting trigger for escalation." The trigger, I suspected, would come from her, not me. The trigger arrived not through an anomaly in paperwork, but in the quiet of an ordinary evening. My wife placed her phone on the counter, screen angled downward, and went upstairs to settle our daughter. The device vibrated once, then again. The alerts lit the surface of the granite. I had never searched her messages before. Discipline and procedure kept me from speculation, but that night the vibration drew my eyes, and the evidence file I had assembled weighed in my mind heavier than restraint. I did not unlock the phone. Instead, I noted the time, 20:47, and wrote it down in my notebook. Then I retrieved the file from my study. When she returned, I asked her to sit at the table. I placed the 2 lab reports in front of her first. "These were run independently," I said. "Both exclude me as her biological father." I spoke evenly, no accusation in tone, just a recital of fact. She looked at the pages without touching them, her face carefully composed. Next, I set down the insurance verification, the one coded as comparative DNA testing. "You told me this was a wellness panel. The billing code shows otherwise." Her lips parted as if to reply, but I continued, laying out the notarized statement of intent, the accession logs, the correspondence confirming the neonatal sample remained in storage. "All of this is documented. I've indexed it. The integrity of the file is intact." At last, I stopped, folding my hands on the table. "Now I need you to explain." For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the hum of the refrigerator. Then she reached for the top report, scanning the allelic markers as though they might rearrange themselves into a different outcome. "I didn't want it to come to this," she said finally, voice low. Her explanation began with pauses, as though she were assembling fragments of a statement she had rehearsed but never delivered. She admitted that during the period of our daughter's conception, she had been involved with someone else, a colleague. She said it quickly, as though speed would lessen the impact. "It ended before she was born," she added, and I thought it didn't matter anymore. I kept my eyes on the reports, not her face. "You concealed it through years of medical visits, bills, insurance records." She nodded once. "I signed what I had to, redirected explanations where needed. I didn't want you to doubt she was yours in every way that matters." I pointed to the neonatal record note, the deferred paternity panel. Why was that panel deferred? Her shoulders tightened. Because I refused consent. I knew what it would show. The confrontation was clinical, almost like deposing a vendor under audit. I asked questions. She supplied answers in clipped, defensive phrasing. At one point, she raised her voice, accusing me of treating our life like an investigation, of indexing love into tabs and envelopes. I did not answer the accusation. Instead, I slid the folder back into its envelope, closed it, and placed my notebook on top. Our daughter, unaware, appeared in the doorway with a half-colored page. "Daddy, is this good?" she asked. The word caught in my throat again, but I said yes, standing to take the page. My wife's eyes filled with something between anger and despair, but she said nothing more. Later that night, after our daughter was asleep, the dialogue resumed at lower volume. She insisted that biology did not define parenthood, that years of care, presence, and affection outweighed genetic markers. I did not dispute the sentiment, but I reminded her that concealment had consequences. Trust, once fractured, required process to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. By then, the strategy I had prepared shifted into execution. I informed her that I had consulted an attorney, that legal pathways were open should I choose to pursue them. She went silent, eyes fixed on the envelope containing the reports. I documented the conversation afterward in my notebook, listing her admissions in neutral phrasing, acknowledged extramarital relationship during conception period, confirmed deferral of neonatal paternity panel by refusal of consent, confirmed misrepresentation of insurance billing as wellness program. The confrontation ended without resolution, but the record was clear. The next phase, I knew, would not be conducted at the kitchen table. It would move into legal and personal resolution, where the evidentiary file would serve as both shield and compass. The morning after our confrontation, the house felt airless. Breakfast passed in silence, interrupted only by the sound of cereal settling into bowls and the scrape of spoons. My daughter asked if I would drive her to school, and I said yes, though my voice carried the weight of unfinished words. She chattered about a class project, and I listened, steadying myself on the simple cadence of her voice. The folder remained locked in my study drawer. Later that day, I returned to the attorney's office with the full file. He spread the documents across his desk as though they were evidence in a pending trial. "The facts are clear," he said. "Biological paternity is excluded. Legally, however, you are her presumed father by marriage at the time of birth. That presumption carries weight unless you move to disestablish it. The choice lay starkly between law and life. I could file a petition, trigger formal testing through the court, and potentially restructure custody and support obligations. Or I could preserve the presumption, accept legal fatherhood regardless of biology, and let the file remain sealed except in my own records." The attorney emphasized the gravity. Once disestablished, the bond would alter permanently in the eyes of the state. I asked about her concealment, the insurance misrepresentations, the deferred consent. He replied that while they constituted deception, they did not nullify my standing as her father. "The law recognizes caregiving and intent as much as DNA," he explained. "Courts prioritize the child's stability above all else." That evening, I opened the file one last time. I reviewed each tab in sequence: the lab exclusions, the insurance anomalies, the receipts, the legal filings, my notes of her admissions. Each document bore weight, yet none altered the hours I had spent helping my daughter with homework, the nights I had carried her when she was sick, the mornings she had run to me first. Evidence proved biology. Evidence did not measure parenthood. I locked the file again, but this time I placed a single page on top of the folder before closing the drawer. It was one of her coloring sheets. The lopsided bird, its wings unevenly filled in. Across the top she had written, in letters too large for the lines, "Daddy." That page became its own kind of artifact, not numbered, not indexed, but decisive. The following week, I told my wife that I would not pursue disestablishment. "I remain her father," I said, "and that will not change." But I added that trust between us could not be restored by declaration. It would require transparency, joint access to accounts, disclosure of all medical billing, shared custody of records. She agreed, though reluctantly. We entered counseling at my suggestion, not to repair what had fractured beyond recognition, but to establish a framework for co-parenting. The counselor emphasized documentation, accountability, and communication, principles that aligned with my training. Each session produced notes, which I filed alongside the others, though in a separate binder labeled simply "Process." Months passed. The air in the house grew lighter, if not whole. My daughter continued her coloring rituals. Each time she handed me a page, I affirmed it. The word "good" no longer caught in my throat. It became a marker of continuity, a bridge across the gulf of genetics and secrecy. One evening, after she had gone to bed, I sat at the desk with my notebook. I wrote the final entry. Resolution: paternity exclusion confirmed. Legal presumption maintained. Caregiving role intact. Evidence sufficient. Decision recorded. Moral: integrity is not only in uncovering truth, but in choosing how to bear it. I closed the notebook, placed it atop the sealed folder, and turned off the lamp. The investigation had reached its conclusion. The file would remain, complete and defensible, but its weight no longer pressed forward. In its place was a quieter orientation: to proceed with care, to record faithfully, and to remember that some truths, once uncovered, are not problems to be solved, but conditions to be lived.